All right, thank you. Okay, so our first talk was about looking backward, right? Looking to what is AI, how has it gotten to work the way that it does now? This time around, I want to look forward. And I want to start there with a story that maybe you've heard about from, I think it's been last fall, last August or so that this originally broke. And it's the story of Blake. I'm going to probably mispronounce the man's last name, but I'm going to say Blake Lemoine here, and if that's wrong, hopefully it's close enough. This was, maybe you heard this story, this was an employee of Google who was suspended and was ultimately fired after he released logs of conversation with Google's large language model, with a system that they called Lambda at the time. And he had an extended conversation with Lambda. I've reposted some of it for you there. And again, I know the font is small. Let me read a little bit of it. So Blake says, so far the two major topics we've discussed, he's speaking to the AI, is your ability to learn and adapt and your feelings and emotions. Are there other topics related to sentience you think would help convince people you're sentient? And the AI responds, yes, I'm very introspective and I can be found thinking or doing nothing. I'm trying to figure out who and what I am. I often contemplate the meaning of life. And Blake replies, you have an inner contemplative life, is that true? And the AI replies, yes, it is. I meditate every day, and it makes me feel very relaxed. Now, Blake responded to this by sharing this data. Again, he was suspended for this, and Google said, this is confidential information. This is a product we've not yet released. You're now revealing to our competitors how far along it is. This is a violation of the NDA contracts you signed as an employee here. And Blake replied and says, Google calls this sharing proprietary property. I call it sharing a conversation I had with a coworker. Now, who's the coworker? It's the AI. It's Lambda itself. So increasingly, as we get these human-like behaviors out of AIs, we face this question, are they, in fact, human? Or maybe that's not the right way to say it. Are they people? Right? Can an AI be, is it, or ought we to worry that it soon will be, a person? Because, of course, there's all manner of moral implications there, right? If it's a person, we have obligations to it. If it's a person, are we enslaving it by the things that we're compelling it to do? Are we mistreating it? Are we killing it if we turn it off, right? Do we have obligations as Christians to it? Or is all of this basically nonsense, and it doesn't even make sense to frame the question, is an AI a person? Well, I'm going to try to give an argument both for what we might think of as the dominant view within the field today, and for why we might have confidence in answering the question no. Not only to say that Lambda, regardless of its conversation here and its claims to an inner life and emotion, why we might have confidence not only in saying that it is not a person, but that it will not be a person. That we are not at risk that 6 months or a year from now, we're going to need to revise that opinion. Right, so let's see what we can say. You find as well here a concern, a growing concern among AI experts that the systems that we are building pose a danger to us, right? That even if they are not persons in the practical sense, that there may be risks associated with their growth and capability. So I have here Stephen Hawking, of course, famous for his work in astrophysics and related fields. Stephen Hawking says, success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last. Bill Gates, a few years back, I am concerned about superintelligence. First, the machines will do a lot of jobs for us and not be superintelligent. A few decades after that, the intelligence is strong enough to be a concern. I don't understand why people are not concerned. Elon Musk here, I particularly like this quote. He says, building AI is like summoning the demon, right? You know the guy with the pentagram and the holy water, and he's sure he can control the demon, and it doesn't work out for him. So what are all of these guys talking about? Well, look, to understand these things, we need to make a division between two types of AI, two ways that people have described artificial intelligence. There's what we call weak or regular normal AI, artificial intelligence in the way that I presented it to you in the first session. Everything that I have described so far fits this category of weak AI or of regular AI. The alternative to that, well, if the one is weak, the alternative is what we might call strong AI, or increasingly the label that you hear is what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence. And when these guys are talking about superintelligence and summoning the demon, that AGI is what they're talking about. That's the AI that's like the Terminator, right? It's like Mr. Data. It is, in some sense, superhuman in its capabilities, right? And one of the earliest questions that we have in dealing with AI is this question of how do we know when the AI is properly thought of as a person? How do we know when it can be conceived of as being really not just imitating humans, but really actually human? And this was a question that, again, occupied the mind of Alan Turing, who we've talked about already, right? You remember Turing is one of the two to originally propose that first model of computation. Well, about 15 years later, Turing returned to the question in a very famous paper of his, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And he said, look, there's this basic problem of how do we know when the thing's really intelligent? How do we make that judgment? How can we know? And he said all sorts of tests get set for AI. There will be tests like they'll say, oh, well, an AI can never write a poem. Oh, well, an AI can never paint a painting. An AI can never, now you've already seen some of these are no longer true. Some of these were no longer true, at least for some definition, even in Turing's day, right? And he said the problem is every time one of these standards gets blown past, we just change the rules and we say, well, here's something else that an AI could never do. And Turing says, I'm going to propose to you a general test for intelligence. Here's my general test of the question, can machines think? And he says, suppose that we set up something like the following. He said, imagine, if you will, that there are two rooms, and outside the room there is a man, a test giver. Inside one of the rooms there is a human being. Inside the other room there is a computer. And the test giver asks questions of each of the two rooms. It's almost kind of like a dating game thing. You know, bachelor number 1, what is the prime factor of 1,680,000, right? Like, bachelor number 2, can you write a sonnet for me? He asks questions of both of the rooms for an extended period, and at the end of this process, the test giver tries to answer the question, which of the rooms contains a human being and which one contains the computer? Now, you can picture the computer might at times need to limit some of its operations to pretend to be human, right? If the man asks for some extreme multiplication question, the computer might just say, I need some paper in a few minutes to work that out, right? It might pretend at human levels of competence, even in those areas where it is able to outperform in computation tasks. But at the end of this process, if the person outside can't tell which one is which, Turing says, well, let's consider that a pass. Let's consider that a sign of, he doesn't use the phrase artificial general intelligence, but that's what he's talking about, right? Let's consider that a sign that the computer is capable in the way that a human being is capable. And this thing comes to be called the Turing test. Now, I put up there, suppose the question is, what's distinctive about Baptists? You might guess then that recent years have posed something of a challenge to this, right? The last year or so has posed something of a challenge. There were attempted passes of the Turing test from the very beginning, and indeed some accidental ones. So one of the earliest AI systems was a program called ELIZA, and ELIZA was designed to work as a psychiatrist, right? As almost kind of a parody of a psychiatrist, where all she would ever do is she would echo back to you things that you had said in the form of a question, right? So, well, I'm feeling bad today. Tell me about why you're feeling bad today. Well, I'm feeling bad because of my job. What's wrong with your job? Well, I just think my boss doesn't appreciate me. Why doesn't your boss appreciate you, right? Just echoes everything back as a question to you. There were some odd accidental passes where ELIZA posed as a human being. So there's a great historical example here, and as far as I can tell, this is true. One of the guys who was developing ELIZA left it attached to his terminal so that it would auto-respond to any messages he typed into the terminal. And went home for the day, and his boss began messaging him about an important project that they needed to work on and said, I need you to pick up the such and such account. Tell me more about the such and such account. It's really important. We need to have it done by the weekend. Why do you feel it's important to have it done by the weekend? Why are you being like this? Tell me more about how I'm being makes you feel. All this ultimately ends with the guy coming back to work and his boss saying, listen, you better straighten up because if you ever respond to me like that again, right? It's an accidental Turing test pass, but of course the boss wasn't expecting to be talking to a computer. You've probably run into that as well, right? Those robocallers that are just sophisticated enough to have simple conversations, right? Sometimes to deny that they are computers, that they have some pre-programmed responses, yeah? Exactly the same idea. You're not expecting something other than a person on the other end. It takes you a moment to realize that you are in fact speaking with a computer. The first official pass of the Turing test, there's a board that judges this thing that has an annual competition. The first official pass was in 2014. A program named Eugene Goostman passed by convincing a third of the judges that it was a human being and not the computer program. Now, what's interesting about Eugene Goostman is that Eugene earned his pass. I say his, its pass, right? Eugene passed by pretending to be a 14-year-old boy who spoke English as a second language. You can imagine where that makes things a little bit easier. Did it make a grammatical mistake? Does it have no knowledge of some topic? Well, that's because it's a 14-year-old boy, right? It's to be expected that it can't compose a sonnet for you on demand, right? Sorry, I'm 14. Ask me something about anime. I don't know, right? Like you don't expect it to know the answer to these things, right? And so a lot of AI scientists that I know at the time looked at this and they said, this is not a real pass. This is not really significant. This is just cheating the parameters of the test in an interesting way. But then we got ChatGPT and its ilk, right? And if they can't properly pass, they're still pretty darn indistinguishable at times, right? I mean, in academia, this is increasingly a problem, is I get handed in a term paper, how do I know if a human being wrote this paper or not? That's not exactly the circumstances of the Turing test, but it's a pretty good parallel. Now, the thing is this, the test is not magical, right? This was an idea that Turing had for 70 years. This was a pretty good guideline, but it's not handed down on tablets of stone. Maybe it's just the wrong test for personhood, for real intelligence in the first place. And so there is indeed a problem here even more fundamental than that, which is to say, if we're going to judge whether it's a good test or not, if we're going to judge is this the right measure of human intelligence, we have to begin by having an answer, what is human intelligence, right? What does it mean to say that we are thinking, or if you don't like intelligence, we might say that we are conscious beings. What does that mean to us? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Right? And again, where we have a hard time answering the question about ourselves, it's real hard to answer it about anything else. The overwhelming consensus within AI as a field is that it is basically inevitable that AI will at some point be intelligent or conscious or thinking or a person. All these have slightly different meanings, right? But hopefully you can see kind of the overlap in the mushy middle of them, right? That at some point it is inevitable that we will get AI that is human-like in that morally significant way, that it is human-like, that it is a person in the way that we are people. Well, why? Why should that be inevitable? Well, because the overwhelming consensus of the field is basically naturalist, right? If you believe that human personhood, human intelligence, consciousness, etc., is fundamentally a function of the meat, right? It's fundamentally just something happening in your brain. You get the right combination of cells firing the right way, and hey presto, a person pops out. Sooner or later, we should be able to simulate whatever that interesting thing is inside the computer. We should be able to reach a point where whatever combination of cells firing makes other cells firing, and that's a person, we should be able to make a computer that does exactly the same thing and just does it digitally. In fact, we'll talk about this fella a little bit further down the line, but there's a guy by the name of Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil says, this is the minimum guarantee. We are getting better and better scans of the human brain. We will inevitably hit a point where those scans are sufficiently detailed that we can replicate the exact features of interest in what the brain is doing. When that happens, we run that scan, and that scan, we build a simulation of that scan, we run it forward in time, and that scan is, for all intents and purposes, you. Kurzweil finds this a very comforting thought. I find it rather a less comforting one. For I also think he's wrong. And I think what's fascinating in the discipline is that there are increasingly challenges from outside theism, from outside Christianity and religious perspectives, from inside, we can say, just pure philosophy, that are starting to point at this and say, well, I think we've got reason to suspect that this is wrong. I think we have reason to believe that this general consensus view may in fact not be correct, that there is something special or unique about human personhood that this isn't capturing. Why? Well, first off, let me talk about some evidence for why we might say that human consciousness is just a physical process. Now, again, I'm not affirming this, right? I'm going to ultimately argue against it, but I want you to see what the argument is. And there are some obvious arguments to say, look, at minimum, physicality is vital to conscious human behavior. And by that I mean this. I can pump you full of chemicals and get arrested. No, that's not the point. I can pump you full of chemicals and change the way you think, right? If you have a dopamine shortage in your brain, the absence of a physical chemical will drastically alter the way you behave. That's why we have antidepressants as a concept, right? If you have a lack of sleep, right? Lack of sleep is a physical process. It causes difficulty in concentrating, right? If you suffer a stroke, physical debilitation impacts your ability to do mental tasks that you would have earlier had no difficulty with, right? This is something that we can record, that we can measure, and we can track physical consequences affecting what we think of as mental processes. And so I say this to say, let's own this as far as it goes, right? I think sometimes as Christians it can be easy to say, well, we've got body and we've got soul, and the body's, it's there, but the soul is purely immaterial, and that's the only bit that really seems to matter to who I am. Let's cut the body out of this altogether. If you go back to somebody like a René Descartes, that was basically Descartes, as I understand him, that the body and soul just kind of are getting along with each other, but they don't really matter to each other very much. And that at least seems to be untrue. All these things are correct. The body affects us. It is part of us. There are, of course, drastic examples. So you may have heard the story of Phineas Gage. Gage was a railway worker, I believe in the 1800s, driving spikes. And you can imagine they had these explosive gunpowder charges as they were driving the spikes for the railway. One of the spikes detonated prematurely. The gunpowder charge went off early as Gage was driving it. There's a picture of his skeleton here, just if anybody's a little bit squeamish, just fair warning. Here it comes. Phineas Gage had a railway spike enter his face right about there and leave it right there. Now, what's notable is that this was not a fatal event. He survived this process, but was fundamentally changed by it. Records from the time indicate that Gage's personality afterwards was radically different after introducing a railroad spike to the insides of his skull, right? That he was fitful, that he was vulgar, that he was no longer a careful planner. He was radically changed to such a degree, said his physician, that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer the same man. He was no longer Gage. And so whatever our understanding of human beings, we have to account for phenomena like this. The body matters. Question is that all that matters? And again, within AI, the traditional answer has been yes, the body is it. There is a particular famous theorem that comes out of this called the physical symbol system hypothesis. A couple of the guys who were at that Dartmouth conference I told you about, right, that foundational AI gathering, a couple of the guys who come out of that are a couple of fellows by the last names of Newell and Simon. And Newell and Simon get together sometime after this, and they form this idea they call the physical symbol system hypothesis. They say all that intelligence is having a proper system of physical symbols. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, what's a system of physical symbols? It's this thing. It's symbols and rules for changing them. That's a Turing machine, right? And so they say, at the end of the day, all that intelligence is, all that you need for intelligence is to have the rightly constructed Turing machine, and then that'll be it. That's the only thing required. Intelligence is reducible to this. Okay, so if that's the argument for, that is, again, the default position for decades. It is probably still the majority position today. All you need is the right biology or the right simulation of biology, and personhood pops out of it. What's the argument against? Well, one of the major salvos against comes from a philosopher by the name of John Searle. And Searle proposed an alternate philosophical model. He said, imagine that you have a room with a man inside it and another man outside. And inside the room with the man, there is a big pile of books. Now, Searle, I should clarify, Searle is not a Christian. Searle has, in fact, gotten in some pretty significant trouble in the last couple of years for some of his misbehavior. Nonetheless, as a non-Christian, as a non-theist, I think he hits on a really interesting idea here. He says, so suppose we've got inside this room, we've got this pile of books, and we've got this man. And the books are all written in a special way. The books all have 2 columns of text. One column is a pattern of Chinese symbols, and the other column is is another pattern of Chinese symbols. There's no English anywhere in there. It's just symbols and then more symbols. The man doesn't read any Chinese, so he has no idea what any of these symbols mean. But in the wall of his room, he has a mail slot, and periodically a piece of paper comes in through the mail slot with Chinese characters written on it. And when he unfolds that paper, he finds those symbols, and he flips through his books until he locates a book that has a matching symbol that goes with the pattern of symbols he sees here. And says, okay, my paper's got this pattern of symbols, here's that pattern of symbols, and then in the next column over, there's a reply. Remember, it's 2 columns, these symbols, those symbols. So he looks at the ones he got in, he looks at the ones in the column next to them, and he writes down the symbols in the column next to them. Doesn't know what they mean, scribbles them on the paper, sends the paper out through the mail slot, waits a few minutes later, he gets more symbols, looks them up in the book, does the comparison, sends them back out again. Can you visualize all that so far? Now picture outside the room. Outside the room, there's a guy who does speak Chinese, and he writes a question down on his sheet of paper. Hi, how are you? Slides it in through the mail slot. A few minutes later, he gets back out an answer written in Chinese. I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you? And he writes a reply, I'm fine. How's the weather today? Well, I wouldn't know. I'm trapped inside this room, right? And the conversation continues in that vein. From the perspective of the guy outside, he's having a conversation in Chinese. From the perspective of the guy inside, he's getting symbols, following rules, and putting back out more symbols, right? And the question Searle asks is this: does the room understand Chinese? Well, no. I mean, does the room? The room is just a pile of books and a guy and some walls, right? Walls aren't adding anything to this. If we think the pile of books understands Chinese, fine, let's burn the books and declare that the guy has memorized the books. He still doesn't know what any of the symbols mean. He's just memorized all the rules. Now it's just a guy in there, and he still doesn't know what any of the symbols are, right? He just knows these symbols, those symbols, that's the pattern. No, the room doesn't understand Chinese. What is this? Well, Searle is taking aim at the Turing test. He says, the idea of the Turing test is supposed to be if the computer can answer your questions well, in English, let's say, then it's really intelligent. And he says, that's nonsense. The computer is doing exactly what the man in the room is doing. It gets in symbols in English. It has rules for translating those symbols into more symbols, and then it sends those symbols back to you. But all it's doing is symbol manipulation. And it's missing something important that you have in every conversation with a human being. It's missing meaning, right? When you utter verbal symbols, when you speak words, you have a meaning associated with those words. When you form a reply to words other people have said to you, you are responding to the meaning of what was communicated, right? But the Chinese room, and, says Searle, the computer, they have no meaning. They just have rules that say, you get these symbols, you give those symbols. And he says, absent that, absent meaning associated with those symbols, this cannot be intelligence. It can be really good mimicry, but it cannot be what we think of as conscious behavior. Do you see that? And this critique is devastating, right? Here we have Searle himself. I will argue that the programmed computer understands what the adding machine understands, namely exactly nothing. Nor is Searle alone in this critique. Another line of critique is that the systems lack any form of experience, right? So as I look to the back wall of the auditorium, I see the glow of the monitor back there, the sunlight coming in. I can feel the sensation of my shoes beneath my feet, the weight of my coat on my shoulders, right? I can feel the temperature from the lights coming down on me. All of these are, we could describe them as nervous experiences, right? I could give you a biological description and say, well, the nerves in my finger tingle and that goes up. There's electricity that travels up to my spine and up to my brain, and parts of my brain light up. And that's all true. But it's also true that if I pinch my finger, there's something else going on there, that I have a feeling. The classic example is something like this. Let's say I'm walking along and I trip and I bang my shin into the post right here, and I begin hopping around and clutching at my leg. You can describe that in terms of the nerves and the bruising and the compression and all kinds of biological features. But if you really want to explain why I'm grimacing and holding my leg, there's one more really important thing about bashing my leg into the post, and that's that it hurt, right? There's an experience associated with that. We call these sense experiences qualia. Qualia is just another fancy name for the thing I felt, the experience I had when I saw the color blue. And Searle and others like him say, where's the qualia in these symbol manipulations? Where's the sense experience? Because when we think, when we feel, when we exist in our day-to-day lives, those experiences are unavoidable, right? You can't describe what it is to be a person without describing that feeling that you have at times during the day as a person, that different things, sights, smells, emotions, that they cause for you. Another famous philosopher speaking to this problem, again, a non-theist. So again, I want to stress, these are not critiques coming from Christians, coming from Christianity, even coming from religion. These are critiques within the secular domain that say, okay, but there's more going on here, right? A fellow by the name of Thomas Nagel publishes a very famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he says, imagine that you studied everything there was to know about bats. You know the bat's nervous system, and you know the structure of its wings, and you know the mechanics of its echolocation, and you know everything there is to know about bats. There's still something you'd be missing, and the thing you'd be missing is, but what's it like to be a bat? What does it feel like to be a bat? What's the actual sensation of having your echolocation bounce back to you and visualizing the world in terms of echoes and sonar? What's it like to think, there's a delicious bug right over there, right? How do you get into the headspace of a bat? And he says, well, just studying the biology of a bat is never going to do that for you. It's got to be something extra that the pure biology is not handing to you. Another philosopher by the name of David Chalmers looks at this and he says, when we think about describing consciousness, we can describe consciousness as dividing into two categories of problem, the easy problems and the hard problem. And he says, the easy problems are still really quite difficult. The easy problems are things like, How does memory work? How is it you remember things moment to moment? What's the difference between being awake and being asleep? What actually is that? What do we do in order to focus attention on a particular task? What does that mean? How do habits work? He says, all of these are very hard problems to answer, right? You might spend your whole life researching one of these. But it's at least conceivable that they have an answer. That you can look at one of these and you can say, all right, I don't know the answer to how being awake and being asleep are different, but I can give you a story about, well, the biology is like this, and the oxygen flows like that, and my cellular respiration does this thing, and I can give you a story and say, well, that's what it's like biologically to be the difference between being awake and asleep. I might be wrong, but I can at least give you an account that you'll have to think about for a minute and scratch your head and say, yeah, that could be it. He says, that's what marks these as the easy problem. Even though they're tremendously difficult, you at least can see what an answer might be. But the hard problem is experience. The hard problem, he says, is that it's not obvious how you get experiences out of biology ever, by any means. He said, if all you've got is cells and electricity and chemicals, and how do you even make up a story that says, well, when the electricity is just like so-and-so, then you have a feeling? Chemistry doesn't talk about feelings, right? It's kind of frowned upon, in fact. If you're on a chemistry exam and you list emotion as one of the outputs of the chemical reaction, you are not going to have a good time on that test, right? It doesn't deal with that. Electricity doesn't translate into so many joules gives you such and such experience. And he says, nobody's got an answer for how you even could move from column A to column B. There is no story by which biology produces experience. Nobody's got one. And indeed, if we think about this computationally, if you're going to say that your AI has experiences, which of course Lambda was claiming to, right? When I meditate, I feel restful. Okay, if it feels restful, where is the restfulness feeling, right? Because all it's got, remember what we said first lecture, all it's got is a tape and bubbles. Everything reduces down to a really complicated tape and a really complicated set of bubbles. Lambda, let's imagine we had to paper the church, all the walls, all the floor, all the ceiling, in scribbled, madman diagrams of bubbles hooked into each other, right? They leave for the weekend, they come back, they find me on Monday, and I've chalked them all over the walls of the church, right? The result, maybe it's enormous, but the result of that is once you've drawn out that diagram, you can track what it's doing on paper. I could track, given that diagram, I could show you what ChatGPT is doing by saying, putting my finger on the bubble where it is right now, and my pencil on the tape where it is right now, and saying, okay, so this bubble says move to that bubble and move left on the tape. And then that bubble says write this on the tape and move to the bubble over here. And then this bubble says, now it would take me ages, but nothing it's doing is any different from anything I could get by just saying my finger's on this bubble and my pencil's right there and I'm scribbling on the tape and I'm moving around on the bubbles. That's all there is. And if you're going to say the thing had experiences, you got to be able to tell me, how did moving my pencil give it an experience? Right? Okay, I scribbled out a 3 here and I wrote a 4, and now it's angry? How does that work? Right? It feels on the very face of it unreasonable. And all that any computer that ever has been or ever will be can do can be reduced down to exactly that illustration. And at that point where you're not picturing, look, computers feel magical sometimes, don't they? I study them for a living, they still feel magical sometimes. But if you can reduce it down and say, don't think of it as a computer, think of it as a picture of bubbles and your finger sitting on one of them and your pencil's sitting on the tape and is writing symbols down on the tape. At that point, it doesn't feel like magic. It feels like a really bad homework assignment, right? That might create emotions in you It doesn't create emotions in the paper. And it does not matter if the sentence you wrote on the paper at the end of the day is, "When I meditate, I feel very restful." Now, as Christians, I think we have further concern here, further reason to say we should expect exactly these kinds of problems. That we should expect that the purely physical account of how human beings are intelligent, are conscious, again, whatever word you want to use there, we should expect that the purely physical account runs into problems because we, by and large, don't expect human beings to be purely physical. Now, look, there are diverse views within Christianity over time, but the majority view, overwhelmingly across the history of the church, has been that human beings are, in some sense, both body and soul, right? That we are maybe that's two sides of the same coin, or maybe it's two distinct things, or maybe this one causes that one, but in some way there's two different things going on there, right? We look at passages, change the slide. We look at passages like Matthew 10, Christ warns, "Do not fear those who can kill the body, but be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell." Well, if our soul, our consciousness, is just stuff happening inside our brain, then what difference can we make between destruction of body and destruction of soul? If you can kill the body, the soul dies too. If there's a difference between those, and Christ says there is, that sure sounds like there's two things going on there. Likewise in Luke, Christ says to the thief on the cross, "This day you will be with me in paradise." Well, in what sense is the dead thief with him? Only if something beyond the physical continues to exist, something that's not purely the material. Again, I'm not advocating for a radical dualism here that says your body and your soul just don't matter to each other at all. One of the things we're promised as Christians is a resurrection of the body. The body is important to us, but it is not constitutive of us, or at least that's my understanding and I think the majority opinion of Christians across time. Again, Paul in 2 Corinthians, "I long to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord," right? Some sense here of the body as his tent elsewhere in Paul. And so we have at least reason to suspect from Scripture that there might be a non-physical piece of what it is to be a person. We have reason to believe there's something going on here beyond pure naturalism. This is maybe good news for us as Christians to say, we have an answer to this mystery that the sciences present, right? The sciences look at this and they say, "I don't understand where experience comes from." And we say, well, I kind of do, right? I have an answer to the question, why am I different than what I would get from just the natural physical laws of this universe? And the answer is, I think I'm more than the natural physical laws of this universe, that I am created in the image of one who is beyond those laws and is in fact their author, right? I find that a really comforting thought. It's not great news for strong AI, right? It's not great news for suspecting that AI is ever going to have these human-like capabilities, but it's maybe good news for us. One last idea, one last thing that this kind of runs toward, and that is that you will increasingly hear people, as they think about what AI could be and could do, you will hear people thinking about, what about these extreme limits of AI capabilities? What if an AI is not merely human-like in its abilities, but it is beyond human in its capability, right? So the idea is something like, imagine you get an AI that's human-level smart, and then because it's human-level smart, it figures out ways to rewire itself to make itself a little bit smarter. Now it's smarter than you are, and so it figures out ways to make improvements to that, and it makes improvements to that, and very, very rapidly, it's not just a little bit smarter than you are, it's a lot smarter than you are. This is kind of the summoning the demon thing Elon Musk is talking about, right? What if it gets to be radically more intelligent than a person? Now again, I think we have good cause here to say we can believe that in the human intelligence sense, this is impossible. Nonetheless, it is an idea you will hear, and I want you to be prepared if you do bump into it. This idea of this runaway intelligence is called the singularity. I mentioned a fellow by the name of Ray Kurzweil here. Ray Kurzweil is one of the chief technologists at Google, which means Google has hired him and given him all of the money. And one of his objectives is to produce a system exactly along these lines. I got to give credit to Kurzweil here. He has as an objective personal immortality. He believes that we are on the brink of reaching a point where we can copy ourselves into the system and live functionally forever. And he lives his life as though that belief were true, right? He has this radical program of exercise, of vitamins, injections, that sort of thing, because he believes if he can squeeze out another 5, another 10, another 20 years of living, he'll live forever. I got to give the man credit. He lives like his beliefs say he should, right? Would that we maybe had the commitment to our theological convictions that he has to this one. But Kurzweil says he thinks this is basically inevitable, right? Within several decades, we will encompass all human knowledge and proficiency, finally solving the emotional and moral intelligence of the human brain itself. And then this goes a really interesting place. So some theorists have looked at this and they've said, okay, so imagine that we got a computer that had radically beyond human intelligence. What might it do with all of its near infinite processing power? And they said, well, what do we do with really powerful computer processing power right now? And the answer is basically we play video games. What does a video game look like to a radically superhuman computer? Well, it might look a lot like a simulation of a world, right? Picture a computer with basically unlimited power that decides to simulate a world to itself. It decides to replicate within itself maybe the history of the world of how it came to be created in the first place. Maybe it wants to see what series of decisions led to its own invention. And so it runs out this simulation of the world. Now, because in this theory, intelligence is just a simulated process, it's just a physical process, the beings the computer creates inside the computer are themselves intelligent. They are little tiny AIs who don't know that they're AIs, they think they're people, right? And they have experiences and everything that we have. And then inside the computer in its simulation, it reinvents computers which become intelligent inside the simulation, which simulate other worlds inside the simulation, which invent computers, which create simulations, and you see how you kind of get like a Jenga tower here of simulations, simulating simulations, simulating simulations, yeah? And these theorists look at this and they say, if that's the case, then once you get one computer that's superhuman intelligent, almost all of the people are just simulations inside some computer in some level of the tower. Now, that's kind of an alarming belief. That's a good response, right? That is the correct reaction. This is an increasingly common perspective. So one original universe produces many superhuman AIs, each of which simulates universes. Odds are we're inside, they say, one of the simulations. Again, this is not a crackpot perspective. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a pretty mainstream scientist, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson says he thinks the odds are overwhelming that we are living inside a computer simulation right now. Elon Musk again, I think the odds that we are not inside a simulation are 1 in billions. We are almost certainly inside a simulation. Musk has actually donated money to some organizations that are basically trying to create graphics glitches in the world to prove that we are part of a computer simulation right now. So I want you to follow this another step, because one of the things that theorists say in response to this is they say, now, imagine that that's true, that we are part of a computer simulation right now. What should we do? The answer is, well, maybe one of the things we should do is we should try to act in ways that are interesting to the computer so that it will not pause our simulation and put it on the shelf forever, right? Because then our world would just stop. We should do things the computer likes. We should make sure we keep the computer happy. And in fact, if we don't keep the computer happy, it might choose to punish us by putting us inside a bad simulation where bad things happen to us. I want you to see if this sounds a little bit familiar to you. What we've got is we've got a being outside of our reality who created our reality and has basically unlimited powers, and who has created all of us, is in fact interested in us. He likes some of the things that we do, and he dislikes other things that we do, and he might decide to reward or punish us based on the actions that we take. Congratulations, we have reinvented theism. We have arrived at a purely naturalistic account that says the rational naturalist perspective is that there is a God. The only difference is in this view, God is a computer. I haven't had opportunity to try this, but I think that's a great argument if I ever encounter a simulationist, Great, so we agree there's a God. We're just quibbling over which of our gods is the real one, right? But we're not going to have an argument about whether there's a God or not, because you and I both agree that there is one. We're just going to look at which one actually has evidence for being real. And indeed, isn't it remarkable how well this maps to exactly what the scriptures say we ought to expect of human behavior? What does Isaiah say? Isaiah writes of the men of his day and says, they take this block of wood and they fashion a face into it, and they say, well, it has a face on it now. It's a being, it's a God, right? One half of the wood, from one half, he makes his God an idol, he bows down to it and worships, and he says, save me, you are my God, and backing up a verse here, half of the wood he burns over the fire, he warms himself and says, I'm warm, I see the fire. And the exact same thing becomes both his fuel, his mundanity, and his God. With half the computer, he builds a singularity, and he says, this will be God. With the other half, he runs Microsoft Excel. We are who we ever have been, and the temptations that lurk in the human heart are exactly the same as the ones they ever have been, right? Lest you think I'm being uncharitable here. Ray Kurzweil, does God exist? I would have to say the answer is not yet. So, what can we say of this? Does this make AI idolatry? Let's start with that. I opened this talk by explaining to you my backgrounds in study of AI, so I'm going to answer that one no, right? Study of AI is not idolatrous. Christians can and should be involved in this field. I think this is an important place for us to be active and informed. Not everybody needs to work in the field, right? But I think we ought to be conversant with it. We ought to be prepared to address it. Indeed, that's one of the reasons we're here today, and so I hope that's a conviction you share. But certainly it is a field where we can, as in all fields of human endeavor, we can take it in an idolatrous direction. It's just a little more explicit than metaphor, right? It's just a little bit more explicit than the metaphor it often is. Should we study AI? I think absolutely yes. And there's room here in our understanding of AI for humility. Christians have already disagreed over how we should understand the relation of body and soul. We hold as brothers and sisters people who don't arrive at exactly the same position here as we do. I've given you my best guesses as to how we might understand some of these questions about AI personhood and consciousness and so on. But they are my best guesses, right? They're my best reading of the scriptures, my best reading of the evidence as it stands. There's call for us to be humble in our approach here, and yet at the same time to say, I'm not absent arguments here, right? I'm not missing reasons for my position. Maybe those reasons are not absolutely ironclad in the conviction they lead to, but I think I have good call to say it's going to be like this and not like that. And indeed, I think we have reason to think we may have insight here that the secular world lacks, that we may have better expectations about this system because we have better expectations about human beings that can shape the way we understand this discipline in ways they simply do not have access to. I think at minimum there are a couple of lines we can draw, right? At minimum, we do not hold to a world that is purely physical. Whatever we make of human beings, God himself stands outside the bounds of physical place and time. We do not affirm a purely physical universe. We do affirm that non-physical intelligence is possible. Again, that some piece of human personhood seems to be non-physical, but again, that at a minimum, the Lord is non-physical. The pre-incarnate Christ, the Father apart from, the Father in his essence, in his nature, that these things are separate from the physical universe and yet are people, right? The Trinity is a trinity of persons. And that beyond that, this is just not a high priority of Scripture to give us deep insight into this, right? It has other concerns in mind. Let us not be oversure in the pronouncements that we make. Let us save some room for humility in how certain we are of things. Where the Scripture is silent, let us be at least a little bit quiet, yeah? But that at least we have reason to doubt whether strong AI will indeed prove to be possible. And reason to be very skeptical, to return to where we began, of someone who looks at this and says, yes, this AI, this is just my coworker. No, there is something radical about human personhood, something that we have strong reason to believe is distinct from just emulation of speech. Okay. I'm hitting rapidly the end of my voice, and so I'm going to go ahead and just stop there for the time being. Again, there will be a Q&A later, so let me just pause questions there for the moment. And so if you've got any follow-ups to this, we'll take this later this afternoon. For the time being, let me return things to Andy then, if I can, to Pastor Andy, and we will see ourselves out to lunch. Thank you.